that time was the biggest mystery of all. Where was Leo Mustinen's airplane? Because no airplane had been found when his remains had been found in October of 2005. Where was his airplane? And to give you an idea of the size of this space, this is my friend Michelle. This is the Mendel Glacier. Leo Mustinen's remains were found approximately here. It's a big area. But is it big enough to hide an airplane? Well, part of the reason of not being able to find the airplane back in October 2005 was it was late October 2005. It had snowed about maybe 4 or 5 inches since the climbers had found Mustinen's remains. And when the Park Service and JPAC came up to the site, this is what they saw. And just barely poking up here are Leo Mustinen's remains. He was barely visible. That's one reason why the airplane couldn't be found. And another reason is because the recovery team was working in temperatures that were below freezing. It was windy. One storm had passed, another storm was on the way. It took them a good 6 hours to chip him out of the ice, isolated onto a pedestal about 6 feet long, 4 feet wide, and about 5 feet deep, weighing approximately 600 pounds. They didn't have time to look for an airplane, but I did. And I found, and with Michelle's help, quickly we found one of the front wheels from the Beech 18. We found both engines. We found a section of the wing. We found lots of little pieces, including a section of the fuselage crumpled up like an accordion. So as Michelle was walking downslope on the glacier looking for more wreckage, I began to traverse along the 12,500 foot contour interval. And the reason I was doing that was because with the Freedom of Information Act information, I had the GPS coordinates from where Leo Mustinen had been found. So I had my GPS unit in my hand, and my thought was to walk to the spot where he had spent 63 years waiting to be found and sit on the rock and admire the scenery and think about his history and how his history has affected all of us. And as I was walking there, I saw an object in the rocks embedded into the ice, and I thought, oh, it's a tree. Now I should point out that at 12,500 feet elevation, there's approximately 50% of the atmosphere that we have at sea level, and that lack of oxygen makes it hard for an old duffer like me to think straight. Because if I'd been thinking straight, I would have realized right off the bat that there couldn't be a tree up here because I'm above the tree level, I'm above tree line. There aren't any grasses, there's no shrubs, no wildflowers, there's no plant life growing up here. How could there be a tree? Well, as I was processing all that in my mind, I saw an object on this tree shining. And as I was walking slowly towards it, I was thinking, oh, it's somebody's wedding ring. Oh, I get it. Some climbers were here a while ago, and one of them lost his wedding ring. And then some other climbers came up at another time, found the ring, slipped it on the branch of this tree, because that second climber knew that whoever lost his wedding ring was going to be in deep doo-doo when he got home. And so he'd get home, he'd realize that he'd lost his ring, he'd turn around, he'd come right back up to look for his ring, and there it would be on this tree shining in the sun. I thought, that's pretty great. All this stuff's running around in my mind, and that's when it all came into my head that no, it's not a tree, it is indeed a ring, and the ring is on the finger of a person. And this is the ring. So I reported my find to the Park Service. They came up and recovered the remains of this second frozen airman. And 6 months later, he was identified as Ernest Glenn Munn, known as Glenn to his family. And this is a photograph of Glenn taken about 2 weeks before he disappeared. Glenn had 3 younger sisters. This is the oldest of the 3. Her name's Jean Pyle. She's 90 years old, still sharp as a whip. I had an opportunity to meet Glenn's sisters at his funeral and also meet all his nephews and nieces. It was a pretty neat experience for me. So I want to tell you something about the airplane they flew in, the Beech 18 AT-7 Navigator. And AT stood for Advanced Trainer. 7 meant that it was used for navigation training. Oops, excuse me. This is the Beech 18. For its time, it had some very interesting design features. The Beech 18 was the first of what we might consider to be a corporate airplane. Over its 32-year design history, it had 32 different iterations. Over 8,000 aircraft were produced. There's only one other twin-engine aircraft that had a longer design history or a greater number of aircraft produced. That's today's exam question. Anybody know what the other aircraft was? DC-3. So the Beech 18 is also known as the Twin Beech, known as the Twin Beech for obvious reasons. It had 2 engines. When the Twin Beech was first designed and manufactured in the early and mid-1930s, most airplanes only had a single engine. Twin-engine aircraft was pretty unusual. And because aircraft designers didn't have a lot of experience with these type of airplanes, they didn't know how the aircraft would behave if one of the engines was to die. They figured the plane would spiral out of control, and so they designed the aircraft with 2 rudders, so they'd still be able to steer the plane if there was one less engine working. Because it was designated as the AT-7 for navigation, at the top of the fuselage was a celestial dome, another one here, a different type here. The idea is that the navigation students would stand up on a stool with their octant, not a sextant, but an octant, dividing the sky into 8 parts instead of 6, and they would shoot the stars, identify the angle on the stars, just as mariners had been doing for hundreds of years. They could locate their position on the map. Of course, because the airplane is continuing to fly in one direction and take 15 or 20 minutes to take their star sightings, go back to their tables and plot their positions, they never knew exactly where they were, but they always knew where they'd been. When the plane was first designed as a corporate airplane, it actually had a row of seats on one side and a sofa on the other. There's a ridiculous James Bond movie with Roger Moore in it called Octopussy. And at the end of the movie, it has the bad guys are getting away in a Beech 18 that's configured in its original configuration with the seats on one side and the sofa on the other. And travesty of travesty, the airplane was destroyed during the filming of the movie. But if you ever want to see a Beech 18 in flight for a long time, you should check this movie out of the library or wherever you get your movies and just skip to like the last eighth of the movie to see the airplane. The movie itself is whatever. When the plane was modified, though, as the AT-7, they ripped out the sofa and the seats and they replaced them with 3 student chairs and desks. And the description I've read of these, it's just like the ones we all sat in junior high school and high school, you know, with the chair with a desk top attached to the chair. And they just bolted those to the floor, and that's where the students sat during their navigation training exercises. One of the other iterations of the Beech 18, other than the AT-7, was as the AT-11, which was used for bombardier practice. They ripped out the nose and they'd put a plexiglass bubble in there with a bomb sight, and they could go practice their bombardier training. Another interesting part of the design, football-shaped thing. Any pilots here? Second exam question. Anybody recognize what that is? ADF. Yeah, the ADF, housing for the ADF antenna. The AT-7 was equipped to follow radio range course as well as other types of navigation, including using the ADF. Whoops, wrong one. And just in general, I'd like to point out that this is one incredibly beautiful airplane. This is a restored version done by a fellow in Stockton, California by the name of Ty Ramey, and it's restored and configured as the AT-7. We can tell because it has the celestial bubble on it. So let's move to the Mendel Glacier and consider why it took so long for the frozen airmen to be found between 1942, 2005, and 2007. Why did it take so long for the remains to be found? Well, one reason is that glaciers, they're shrinking. The ice in the glaciers is melting faster than the ice is forming. Mendel Glacier is an unusual type of glacier. It's known as a rock glacier. And it's not because it's a bunch of rocks moving like a glacier. It's because it's a glacier with ice with a lot of rock embedded in it, kind of like Rocky Road ice cream. And the rock inside the ice actually insulates the ice so it doesn't melt very fast. This is contrasted to what we call clean glaciers, which are essentially big ice cubes. And while we're talking about glaciers, just to address the confusion between Mendel Glacier, where the remains were found and where I found the airplane wreckage, and Darwin Glacier, where the military thought they were, I have a map from 1947 by the first military trip that went up there, and they had circled Mount Darwin, which in my mind suggests that they thought that's where they were at the Darwin Glacier, rather than next door at the Mendel Glacier. So clean glaciers are big ice cubes. And they are similar to ice cubes that we know very much about. For instance, the clean glaciers on Mount Rainier, the clean glaciers of Antarctica, the glaciers that we associate in the Alps and in the Cascades. These are all clean glaciers, essentially big ice cubes. And because they don't have that covering of rock or that rock embedded in them, they don't have that extra insulation. And clean glaciers are melting so fast that you can come back year after year to particularly the glaciers in California, which are melting really fast. And you can actually chart from year to year the recession of the glacier as it melts further and further upslope. Ice cube. And as I said, the Mendel Glacier is a rock glacier, and here we are standing in the middle of the Mendel Glacier. I know it's hard to believe that this is a glacier because you see all these rocks, but there is a lot of ice in here, and if you were to walk in here and try to kick any of these rocks loose, you'd find that they are severely embedded into the ice. So what does this have to do with why it took so long for the two frozen airmen to be found? Is that any object inside that rock glacier will be deposited in layers, and as because those objects insulate the glacier will melt, but it'll melt down like this instead of clean glaciers that melt up canyon. And any object will insulate the ice, slow down the melting of the glacier, even objects like this section of wing. And so we had to wait a long time for the surface of the glacier to melt down to the level it was at in 1942 when the crash occurred. That's the main reason why it took so long to find the remains. And to give you an idea of how much the glacier has shrunk in those years, X marks the spot, Y marks the spot. This is 2007 at the top and 1948 on the bottom. And you can see that what was once a huge field of ice has been exposed into a huge field of rock embedded in the ice. Same thing over here. A whole lot more of glacier, a whole lot less of glacier in 2007 than there was in 1948. So the glacier is shrinking, and it's shrinking dramatically. The final reason why it took so long to find the remains of the frozen airmen is because the Mendel Glacier is an incredibly remote area, which is not to say that it's hugely difficult to get there. It just takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of dedication, and it's at a high elevation. And the only reason that Cadet Mustinen was found in 2005 is because two guys were coming to climb the Mendel Couloirs. Now these are about 60-degree slope here, steeper, 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 until you get up into here where it's almost vertical. Not very many people get up there. So that explains why it took so long for Leo Mustinen to be found, and it took so long for Glenn Munn to be found, because if I hadn't known about Leo being up there, I never would have gone up there to find Glenn Munn, and he probably would still be there. So the glacier shrinking is one reason, and the remoteness of the area is the other reason why it took so long to find these boys. So, how could the AT-7 crew be lost when there were 3 navigators on board and hopefully a pilot who knew where he was and what he was doing? To answer that question,